The Second Amendment reads, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." However, on the wall of the NRA's headquarters in Fairfax, Virginia, the first half of this amendment is nowhere to be seen. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed adorns the walls of the NRA and is used as the rallying cry for gun rights activists across the country. This Second Amendment right is often construed to mean that each and every American citizen has the individual right to keep and bear arms, but that is a relatively new constitutional interpretation. From the time law reviews were first cataloged through 1959, every law review upheld a collective rights view of the Second Amendment, meaning that it specifically did not grant individuals the right to own a gun, but rather gave American citizens as a whole the right to keep and bear arms for the point of maintaining a well-regulated militia. The Supreme Court refused to rule the Second Amendment guaranteed an individual right outside the context of a militia on 4 separate occasions between 1876 and 1939. Additionally, when the Supreme Court addressed this issue in 1939, with the United States v. Miller case, a collected rights view was officially adopted. This case was in regard to a sawed-off shotgun, and the court ruled there was insufficient evidence to suggest that the shotgun has some reasonable relationship to the preservation or efficiency of a well-regulated militia. The first law review to express support for an individual rights perspective was published in 1960 and cited an article from the NRA's American Rifleman magazine. Following this publication, the NRA hosted an essay competition and donated $1 million to the George Mason University Law School to endow the Patrick Henry Professorship in Constitutional Law and the Second Amendment to foster the authorship of articles supporting their individual rights agenda. To this day, NRA members can donate $10,000 to be considered a Patrick Henry member. The Supreme Court's decision in United States v. Miller held for almost 70 years until 2008, when the court first adopted an individual rights interpretation of the Second Amendment in District of Columbia v. Heller. The decision in District of Columbia v. Heller was made with a 5-4 majority, with all 5 of the justices in the majority being nominated by presidents who were members of the NRA. Of the 34 deadliest shootings from 1949 to present, 17 have occurred within the last 10 years. Half of America's deadliest shootings happened over the 69 years from 1949 to 2008, and the second half occurred throughout the last 10 years. Coincidentally or not, the court supported an individual rights view of the Second Amendment for the first time 10 years ago. Furthermore, half of the 10 deadliest shootings and 4 of the 5 deadliest shootings took place after the District of Columbia v. Heller ruling. From 1949 through the District of Columbia v. Heller ruling, on average, one of the deadliest mass shootings occurred every 3.5 years, with an average of 13.59 people killed per shooting, not including the shooter. From the District of Columbia v. Heller ruling through the present, on average, one of the deadliest mass shootings occurred every 7 months, with an average of 17.65 people killed per shooting, not including the shooter. This suggests that mass shootings have increased in both frequency and number of casualties.
What sets the United States apart, though, is that the NRA is unparalleled in its caliber of influence on gun regulation and reform and America's political arena. Federal laws require licensed gun dealers to run background checks before allowing someone to purchase a gun. However, due to a provision the NRA supported and pushed in 1993 to be added to the Brady Bill, sales can proceed after 3 business days regardless of whether or not someone's background check has been cleared. While the background check system has stopped 2.4 million guns from being sold to dangerous citizens, gun dealers have moved forward with over 15,000 gun sales to people who are prohibited to own guns. While 15,000 may seem small in comparison to 2.4 million, it only takes one sale to a dangerous person to heavily impact our society. One of those 15,000 guns sold to a prohibited citizen was given to the perpetrator of the 2015 Charleston mass shooting, where 9 people died in their place of worship. Almost a decade later, the NRA worked closely with a Republican state legislator from Florida to push through an unprecedented law, the Stand Your Ground law. This piece of legislation allows citizens to use deadly force if they reasonably believe their safety is being threatened in a public place. Since then, using ALEC's model bill, the NRA and ALEC have worked in tandem to expand the legalization of this law in at least 24 states. In Florida, this legislation saw outcomes that were relatively immediate. The Tampa Bay Times reported that justifiable homicides in Florida spiked after the 2005 law from an average of 34 yearly to more than 100 in 2007. In 2012, this law was the basis of the highly controversial Florida case where Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old boy, was gunned down by George Zimmerman while walking home holding only a bag of Skittles and an Arizona iced tea. A 2003 amendment created a barrier to releasing data that is vital to researchers. It stops the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives from sharing information about gun stores that have records of selling firearms that wind up in crime scenes. This makes it absurdly challenging for law enforcement to know which gun dealers are continuing to sell guns to criminals who are not supposed to have access to weapons. Although the NRA and politicians who supported this amendment said it was passed to protect the privacy of citizens and the livelihood of gun dealers who obey rules, researchers believe this law is causing more harm than good. Before this was made law, researchers were uncovering huge disparities in their findings. They reported that roughly 1% of all gun stores in the country accounted for more than half of the crime guns the AFT traced in the late 1990s. And in some cities, it was found that just a few stores were responsible for selling weapons recovered in 70% to 90% of all gun crimes. Without the ability to gather and share similar data today, communities are being put at risk of criminal gun-related activity that could be prevented by uncovering and shutting down gun dealers that are illegally distributing their weapons. In 1975, preparing to challenge Gerald R. Ford for the Republican nomination, Reagan wrote in Guns and Ammo magazine, "The Second Amendment is clear, or ought to be. It appears to leave little, if any, leeway for the gun control advocate." By 1980, the GOP platform proclaimed, "We believe the right of citizens to keep and bear arms must be preserved. Accordingly, we oppose federal registration of firearms." That year, the NRA gave Reagan its first ever presidential endorsement. Years later, Reagan endorsed the passage of the Brady Bill, the aforementioned law that allows the sale of guns after 3 days without a completed background check. In 2004, the National Rifle Association honored Republican Florida State Legislator Dennis Baxley with a plum endorsement, its Defender Freedom Award. More recently, the NRA spent almost $140 million on legislative programs and public affairs. More specifically, the NRA's monies were present in the 2016 election of Donald Trump. Spending more than they ever have on any election, they spent a grand total of $36 million with 4 weeks left in the election. They spent $6.5 million on one pro-Trump ad campaign featuring a woman who spoke about using her pistol to fight off an assailant. However, the NRA's endorsement of Trump and money spent on ads did not solely focus on gun issues. Their first ad campaign had nothing to do with guns. Overall, they spent millions on Trump ads, but they spent even more money, $12 million, on ads attacking Hillary Clinton. The NRA, however, prepped for the possible election of Clinton by spending several million more on Senate races to ensure that Congress would, even if Clinton was in office, protect an individual's right to bear arms. The NRA's economic influence on legislation was clearly seen shortly after Trump's election when he repealed an Obama-era gun registration law that was implemented immediately following the Newtown, Connecticut mass shooting where 20 children and 6 adults were slaughtered inside of Sandy Hook Elementary School. The NRA's political influence does not stop between election cycles, however. They utilize lobbying as an effective means for continuing to promote their agenda. In recent years, the NRA has increased its federal lobbying spending dramatically, going from $1,815,000 in 2007 to $5,122,000 in 2017, more than a 182% increase. Their most powerful lobbyist, Marion Hammer, is nearing her 4th decade as one of the most powerful lobbyists in the U.S., if not the most powerful. She served as the first female NRA president from 1995 to 1998 and is the reason that Florida is often the first place in which the NRA pursues specific gun rights protections. Hammer is not an elected official, but she can create policy, see it through to passage, and use government resources to achieve her aims. Her policies have heavily shaped the way that gun reform is enacted, or rather not enacted at all. Dating back to the 1980s, she crafted the first ever concealed carry statute that has since been put in place in most states. Because of her lobbying efforts, now more than 16 million Americans have concealed carry licenses. She was the creator of the first previously mentioned Stand Your Ground laws as well. She's behind a piece of legislation that punishes local officials who attempt to establish gun regulations stricter than those imposed at the state level. Officials can be fined thousands of dollars and removed from office. The breadth of Hammer's power in Florida can be seen in the ways that state employees, legislators, and the governor defer to her. She gives orders and they follow them. By taking a long-term view on politics and acting as a lobbyist rather than an elected official, she can continue presenting the same bills until they are eventually passed after those who have opposed them are out of office terms. Her political clout can be summed up by one 2012 incident. In 2012, the House Criminal Justice Subcommittee received a bill establishing that a concealed carry permit does not allow a person to bring a gun into a range of government buildings or a child care center. Within days, Hammer had sent an email to the head of the subcommittee informing her that the NRA is opposed to the bill. She continued, "Hope that it will not even be heard." The legislation was left off the voting calendar and died 2 months later.
The top 3 gun manufacturers in the United States were responsible for the production of 4.5 million out of the 11.5 million firearms produced in America in 2016. The annual firearms manufacturing and export report shows the breakdown of the 11.5 million guns manufactured. This $11.7 billion industry is dominated by three huge publicly traded companies: Smith & Wesson, which is a subsidiary of American Outdoor Brands Corporation, Sturm Ruger & Company, and Savage Arms, which is owned by Vista Outdoor. As corporations, these large gun manufacturers are required to file detailed annual reports with the SEC and specific information about the company, from financial statements to corporate governance and everything in between. This report is available to the public and also serves as a source of information for shareholders. These snippets can be found in the Risk Factors segment of Sturm Ruger & Company, Inc.'s 2017 report. The company believes that the lawful private ownership of firearms is guaranteed by the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. With literally thousands of laws being proposed at the federal, state, and local levels, if even a small percentage of these laws are enacted and they are incongruent, the company could find it difficult, expensive, or even practically impossible to comply with them. In 2005, Congress enacted the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. If the PLCAA is repealed, it could have a material adverse impact on the company. For context, the PLCAA is a law that prohibits civil liability actions from being brought or continued against manufacturers, distributors, dealers, or importers of firearms or ammunition for damages, injunctive, or other relief resulting from the misuse of their products by others. Essentially, it allows the gun industry to manufacture lethal weapons used repeatedly in mass shootings with absolutely no repercussions for the effects of putting these weapons in the marketplace. Sturm Ruger is claiming that if this law is repealed, they will be held accountable for the product they produce, which would have an adverse impact on the company. The NRA lobbied for the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. These corporations are rationalizing their opposition to gun control and spreading their opinions to shareholders. This influences stockholders, many of which are already NRA members, and spreads the idea that any type of gun legislation would be detrimental to gun manufacturers, which would be disruptive to the American economy as a whole. As expected, these top three manufacturers donate heavily to the National Rifle Association. The top three manufacturers donate millions every year to the NRA's Institute for Legislative Action, and money flows from other players in the gun industry. Furthermore, the NRA is packed full with gun industry executives. When it comes to making decisions, the NRA has restrictions on members that are allowed to vote, which often leaves the 76-member board of directors, a board that includes executives from leading gun industry corporations, to do the heavy lifting. This creates a board and organization that is self-perpetuating, and that it lobbies for legislation that protects these corporations, and in turn, these corporations donate and support the NRA.